Torah tells us that Aaron, to be installed as the Kohen Gadol, and Klal Yisrael being worthy for the Shekhinah to dwell in the midst, they had to have various sacrifices brought on their behalf. And the Torah tells Vayom Moshe Ze'adovesh Etziva Hashem Tasu. This is the thing which God has commanded you to do. V'yer Aleichem Kvod Hashem, and God's glory will appear to you. V'yer Aleichem Kvod Hashem. So here there's an interesting, very interesting Orach Chaim HaKodesh. He wants to, what do you mean? This is what you should do. What is Ze'ad Dovash Etziva Hashem Tasu? And if you do that, Yer Aleichem Kvod Hashem. The Kvod Hashem, God's glory, will appear to you. So over here, he explains, he cites Rashi. We're speaking about that if the korban, which Aaron is meant to bring, his sacrifice, if they do that, then they'll be worthy that the God's glory should come upon them. He says, he explains it differently. And he says, what qualifies a person to be the location for God's glory to come upon him? He makes it a point. It doesn't say, Vayikru koleid of Yamdu Fnei Hashem. Later, when it says that the Shekhinah came down upon them, the fire came from heaven, and the Shekhinah came upon them, and it says they all prostrated themselves. Over there, it says Vayamdu Fnei Hashem. It says Vayikru koleid of Yamdu Fnei Hashem. It doesn't say Lifnei Ol Moed. It doesn't say they stood before the communion tent. It says they stood before Hashem. So he goes to explain what does it mean to stand before Hashem. Meaning to bring themselves to a mindset of perfection, that in their minds, the way they visualize it, they're experiencing as if they're standing before Hashem. As we find in terms of David says, Shvisi Hashem negdi tovint. David, he always visualized God before his eyes, as if he always stood in the presence of God. And he cites the Ramon Shulchan Aruch, that the Ramon says in Shulchan Aruch, at the very beginning, first halach in Shulchan Aruch, that a person, when you stand before a king, every movement, every nuance of your behavior is conscious. Why? Because you know you stand before the king. But when you're not before the king, you behave differently. But when you have this sense you're before the king, so he says, definitely, the Ramo says, if you're standing and you have a sense you're standing, you're in the presence of God himself, there's no question your behavior will be differently. So it's sensing before who do you stand. If you have a sense you're standing before Hashem, you behave one way. If you don't have that sense, you don't behave that way. So he goes to explain, he quotes a midrash. What is the meaning of Ze'ad Dover? Ze'ad Dover al Hamilo. It's speaking about circumcision. As it says, he cites a pasuk in Yoshua. So he asks, I'm over here, do we find that Moshe had told the Jews to circumcise themselves? All the Jews were circumcised. When they left Egypt, they were circumcised. So he says, we're speaking about when the Torah says a person should do tshuva, the Yetzer Hara is called Orlas Halev. It's called the covering of the heart. As we find the covering of the external part of the body, it's called Orla. And circumcision is the removal of that covering. Identically, tshuva is removing the Orlas Halev, the covering of the heart. The heart is the organ that has all the levels of sense. All the sensory, it comes from the heart. Love lies in the heart. Commitment is dependent on the heart. And therefore, by removing that covering, the heart will function and sense what it's supposed to sense. So when it says you should remove the milah, it's referring not to external circumcision, it's the internal circumcision. 1 second. And he says he found a yalkut, came upon a yalkut, which is also the midrash. This is very important. Amalei Moshe Yisrael, Ose Yetzer Hara, Taviru Milvavchem. That evil inclination remove from your hearts. And when you remove that Yetzer Hara, that evil inclination from your heart, you will all have one perspective of reverence, of fear, ubeitza achas, and you're going to be united in one perspective. When you remove that Yetzer Hara, l'shores lefnei hamokum, to serve before God. When you remove that Yetzer Hara, the Medrash says, you'll be b'yira achas ubeitza achas. You'll have one perspective, and you'll have one yira, the same level of reverence. To avodaschem yuchedes lefonav, and then your service will be unique and special before Him. Dichsiv umaltem es orlas levovim, and Midrash concludes, it says in the pasuk regarding do tshuva, you should remove the covering of your heart, the asisim zeh, and the Midrash concludes, and if you do that, v'yira alech kvar Hashem ad kan ve'dvarim atzmam. And the Or Chaim Kodesh says, literally, the Yalkut is verbatim his interpretation of the pasuk. So, the point I want to make here, the Yalkut says that if you remove the Yetzer Hara from your heart, you'll be b'yira achas ubeitza achas. What does that mean? Why do people go off in each one's own direction? You know, we have our own ideas. Why are we united? Why do we have that one perspective, that one level of reverence? Of course, it's various levels, because each person has his own idea of what it should be or how it should be. Right? Now, there's a question which is asked. We read on the seventh day of Pesach, Shrisha Pesach, this was the splitting of the sea. So to commemorate the splitting of the sea, we read the parsha, the portion of Egypt pursuing the Jews into the Red Sea. But over there, the Torah tells us, Vayisa Mitzrayim Achrei B'nei Yisrael. Mitzrayim traveled after the Jewish people. So the obvious question is, it should say Vayisu. Grammatically speaking, you should say in the plural. The Egyptians in the plural traveled after the Jewish people. They were pursuing us. Why does it say Vayisa in the singular? So over there, Rashi cites the Midrash, B'leiv echod kish echod. B'leiv echod, they were united in one perspective, and therefore they were like one person. The level of unity, because of their objective was to recoup the wealth that we had taken from them, it was B'leiv echod kish echod. We find by Kabbalah Torah, it says, Vayicha no'om kineged ahor. We camped before the mountain. Over there, meaning also the singular, rather than the plural, it doesn't say v'yachnu. Over there, Rashi cites the Midrash, Ki'ish echod, b'leiv echod. It inverts it. Like one person united with one perspective. Regarding the Egyptians, what united them? The perspective. Regarding the Jewish people, we are one essence. At Sinai, we were one essence with one perspective. Ki'ish echod, b'leiv echod. Therefore, it says it in the singular rather than the plural. Now, what happened at Sinai? So, how did they differentiate? What's the differentiation? As I mentioned many times in the name of Rav Chaim Vital, which the Chofetz Chaim cites, every Jew, we find there's a concept known as Kol Yisrael Reivim Zeh Lezeh. Every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. If one Jew sins, it affects the status of the whole Klal Yisrael. A person contributes something positive, everybody is a beneficiary of that. Because in essence, every Jew is a component in the network called the Jewish people. We're one essence, we're one entity. And each of us are part of that entity. Therefore, each of us are responsible for one another. Rav Chaim, the Ramak, or Moshe Kurdvir, and Tomer Devorah speaks about this. The Medrash depicts it very clearly. Two people are sitting in a boat, and a person begins boring a hole under his seat. So his neighbor says to him, "What are you doing?" He says, "What do you mean what I'm doing? I'm boring a hole under my seat." He said, "But you realize when you put that hole under your seat, we all go down together. It's your seat, my seat. We're in the same boat." I mean, every Jew is a component, part of the network called Klal Yisrael. And therefore, as a result of that, what we do positively and negatively, we affect the whole totality of the Jewish people. So what are the Jewish people? We are Ish Echad. What's the problem with not Lev Echad? That's lacking unity. But once we have the unity, we're Ish Echad b'Lev Echad. So it comes out terrific. When did Klal Yisrael assume the status, the classification of Odom? we reinstated as Atem Kriyim Odom, Veim Lo Kriyim Odom. When we assume that status of that person who is the equivalent of Odom Arishon, the original intent of creation. God in time of creation had a relationship with Odom, with Adam on the terrestrial level. When did that repeat itself? At Sinai. We became Odom, Hashem came and had the relationship with us at Sinai. The Aseh Sadibros. If the Jews wouldn't have sinned with the golden calf, the Jews would have lived eternally, the Gemara says. With B'nai Kel Chai. Because of the golden calf, we reverted back to pre-sin. What happened to building the Mishkan? We reinstated as the Odom. That's the Luchas Shniyos, the second set of tablets. So, Koheles says that initially God created Odom Yoshor. He was straight. But because he had his own computations, he became totally corrupted. And that's when he became disenfranchised. He was no longer Odom. He was created Yoshor and Bikesh Cheshbonas Harbe. He made all kinds of computations, and he did the wrong thing. Klal Yisrael were given that status of Odom, and therefore we assume the status of Yoshor. In our essence, we're Yoshor. So what happens to us? When there's a problem, each person goes off in his own direction. So if we go off in our own direction, but who causes us to go off in our own direction? That's the Yetzer Hara. So therefore, it says in the Medrash, remove the Yetzer Hara milevavchem, and then you will be biyira achas be'etz achas. Automatically, because a person who's Yosher, we all see it the right way. We all see it the same way. For that reason. But what causes us to see it differently? Why do we see through these rosy-colored lenses? It's the Yetzer Hara, which causes us. That's the idea. So it's terrific. The Gemara tells us, Barosi Yetzer Barosi Torah Tavlin. When God gives the Torah at Sinai, that's the antidote for the Yetzer Hara. Once we have that antidote, we all see it the same way. We're all in agreement. That brings unity. That was the purpose, the objective of giving the Torah at Sinai. Because what allows the Odom to be Yosher, which is his essence, it's the Torah. It's Barosi Yetzer Barosi Torah Tavlin. The Torah is the antidote for that Yetzer Hara. Therefore, it's good. We say, David Amal says in Tehillim, we say this every Shabbos and Yom Tov, Mesugid Zimra, Pkudei Hashem Yishorim, Mesamchei Leiv. The statutes, the dictates of Hashem are Yishorim, and therefore brings joy to the heart. Who did Hashem give the Pkudei Hashem, which are Yishorim? To the Klal Yisrael, who are Yishorim. In our essence, we're Yishorim, because Hashem made Adam initially Yoshor. He made him straight. Unfortunately, due to his own mindset, he got off track. So what puts us back on track? The Torah puts us back on track. That's Pkudei Hashem Yishorim, because the dictates of Hashem are Yoshorim, therefore brings joy to the heart. Because now, a person goes and he goes to the ophthalmologist and he gives him a new prescription. Or he removes the cataract. And all of a sudden you could see, where until there everything was blurred. When you see, it says, I see clearly now. If we remove the Yetzer Hara, all of a sudden we're reinstated to the Yisharim. We function as Yisharim. And therefore we have joy. That's Pkudei Hashem Yisharim Misamchei Leiv. Therefore the Midrash says, remove the Yetzer Hara from yourselves, and then as a result of that, you'll be B'yira Achas, Ube Eitza Achas, for that reason. Who destroyed the first base of Mikdash? Nebuchadnezzar. He was a Babylonian. The Babylonians destroyed the first base of Mikdash. And because he destroyed the first base of Mikdash, Kodesh Baruch says, I will destroy, there will not be a trace of the Babylonian civilization. It will be totally obliterated. The Navi uses a few words. Nin sher v'nechad. That's the pasuk. There will be no nin. Nin usually means like a great-grandchild. Sher v'nechad. So it says, firstly, the people are going to be obliterated. The language will be obliterated. There won't be a Babylonian language any longer. And there will not be a remnant of his pedigree. Vashti was the last descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, and she was killed by Achashverosh. which we read in the Megillah. Now, so Tosa has a question: how could you say there will no longer be a Babylonian language, even time of Tosus, which is the year 1100, 1150? They still spoke Babylonian in Iraq. So what do you mean the language will no longer exist? So Tosus answers that the language is referring that the royalty had a certain dialect. We're not speaking about the vernacular, which was spoken by the commoners, but there was a dialect that was spoken by the royalty. That dialect will be forgotten. It will not exist any longer. Meaning a representation of the royalty of Babylon will be removed, will be destroyed. Okay? That's Tosa's answer in Megillah. The Maharal of Prague says something differently. Says something phenomenal. He explains what is language. He says, if a Persian speaks Babylonian, does that make him a Babylonian? He explains language is only an expression of the culture. But if the people no longer represent the culture, it's like a German speaking Babylonian or an American speaking French. Doesn't make him a Frenchman. Culture is a perspective. How do you see things? What it means, the perspective of the Babylonians will be obliterated, will no longer exist. Therefore, it's like another nation speaking that language. That's what it means. The language will be obliterated, will no longer exist, expressive, representing what it's meant to represent. That's the Maharal of Prague, how he answers the question. So what I'd said then, we find that initially when the humanity decided to rebel against Hashem, they built the Tower of Babel. And what brought them to this consensus they should build the tower? So the Torah says, because they were Sofa Achas, because they spoke the same language, that brought about this unity, and they concurred, we have to build a tower to rebel against Hashem. So what does God do? He descends and he decides he's going to divide the 70 families into 70 nations, and each nation will have its own language. This was the beginning of languages. And there were 70 languages. And therefore, Rashi cites the Chazal that they weren't able to communicate any longer. And because they weren't able to communicate, they disagreed, they began fighting, they began killing one another, and that brought the project to an end. That's the story of the Tower of Babel. So I ask the question, I mean, even people may not speak the same language, but there are other ways to communicate. So because they no longer actually understood one another, therefore that caused them to actually begin fighting and killing one another. So what I said, no. What's the reason why they concurred and they had a meeting of the minds to build the tower against God? Because they spoke one language. Language is an expression of the essence of a people. All 70 families were one people. They were the family of humanity. What did Hashem do to disrupt this? He created 70 nations, and each nation given another language. Now, each language is a representation of another perspective. It's like you have an Englishman, you have a Frenchman. You understand? They see things differently. The perspective is a different perspective. And as a result of that, that's why we couldn't agree about anything. I have my mindset, you have your mindset. Klal Yisrael in their essence is Ish Echod. We are one essence. Our language is Lashon HaKodesh, is the holy tongue. What causes us to see things differently is the Yetzer Hara. And that's what he says. The Medrash says, remove the Yetzer Hara levavchem from your hearts, and you'll be belevech. You'll have yira achas. You'll have one level of reverence for Hashem, and you'll have be'etz achas, and you'll have one perspective. Once you remove the Yetzer Hara, you have one perspective. What is the Jew's perspective? To serve Hashem. That's the perspective. And that's the Borasi Yitzer Borasi Torah Tavlin. The Torah is the antidote. Once that's removed, then we function, we're all Yishorim. When people see things the right way, and we have a meeting of the minds. There's an expression when you learn, and somebody learns and he elucidates something very difficult. and somebody says to him, Reb Chaim Briska explains the Gemara exactly with the Rambam exactly the way you said it. So there's an expression when you study, you say, when you walk on the right road, you meet many good people. You walk off the beaten path, you don't know where you're going, you don't meet anybody. And a person drives, and all of a sudden nothing looks familiar. You know what the answer is? You're on the wrong road. But if you drive the right road, you meet many people, and now you know you're going in the right direction. It's the same thing. Once you remove the Yetzer Hara, you're be'etza achas and b'yira achas. We have one perspective because we have one level of reverence.